Hey, we're Flick and Joe, and this is our dog Walter. In 2022, we made the crazy decision to quit our full-time jobs, pack up our lives, and move aboard our blue water sailing boat. We spent many months refitting her and getting her ready for our plans until one day we actually did it. We cast off the lines, we pointed her south, and off we went. We've now sailed over 1,000 nautical miles, dodging orcas, yes, actually, and most of the rocks along the way. Join us for the beautiful, quite stressful but endlessly eventful life that is full-time living aboard. In this week's episode, we thought we'd take a look back at the journey we've travelled so far and pull out some of our favourite anchorage spots. That could be helpful for others looking to sail the same seas, as the majority of sailors who head from Northern Europe down to the Med or the Caribbean have to cross the Bay of Biscay and then travel down the treacherous and exposed Atlantic coast exactly the same way as we had to. Wherever possible, we always try to anchor rather than stay in marinas. It's easier because there's no messing about with lines and fenders, and obviously the main benefit is that it's cheaper. Marinas can be really expensive, particularly in the high season. Something that surprised us as we sailed south is that the nature of this coastline being pretty exposed means that you don't actually have much choice, and marinas often really are your only option. Saying that, there were some awesome spots, so we thought we'd share our guide to 5 amazing anchorages that we found along the way that will save you some pennies, shelter you from bad weather, and potentially feed you some awesome adventures just like we had. First, a little bit of homework for you. Do you know how to anchor your boat safely, and are you set up nicely for living on an anchor? Joe did a whole heap of research before we left Plymouth to make sure that we were set up for exactly that, life anchor. We have a 25 kilo rocknet anchor and around 100 metres of chain available for us to use. The rule of thumb varies depending on who you speak to, but we generally tend to go for a 4 or 5 to 1 ratio. So that's for every metre of depth we put out 4 to 5 metres of chain. After we've laid out our chain, we then set up a snubber, which goes back to 3 points of contact on the boat and takes the pressure off the windlass. We then back down at our anchor at 2,000 revs. That means we reverse against it to make sure that it's dug in nicely and that we aren't dragging. In terms of finding good spots to anchor, we use an app called Navily, aided by Navionics. Navionics has excellent charts with user input rocks, obstructions on the seabed, ditched anchors, or anything else that you might get caught around. Navily is a cruising guide fed by fellow cruisers. It's full to bursting with reviews, photos and advice, identifying all the best anchorage spots on your journey. It's a godsend, so if you don't already have it, then we definitely recommend downloading Navily and Navionics. So, let's get to it. Here are 5 of our favourite anchorages on the Atlantic coast, starting from 5 and working our way back to number 1, our hands down favourite. Coming in at number 5 are the Sierras Islands. If you're planning on visiting the Rias in northern Spain, then you might spot the Sierras Islands as being a recommendation on TripAdvisor, and it's well worth the hype. However, as a cruiser, you do need to apply in advance for a permit to anchor here and go ashore. We'll pop a link in the description below. For those of you cruising with dogs, remember that it's not dog friendly, so bear that in mind before you drop your hook. The permit is free, but you do need to have proof of it just in case you're asked. We weren't, but you never know. We stopped off at the Sierras Islands before being hauled out on Vigo to check the damage to our keel from our earlier rock hitting incident. Click the link on the screen here if you don't know about that yet. It was toasty when we got to Sierras, so we went in for a dip in the sea before heading to shore. Because Walt is pretty clingy sometimes, Vizslas, as you might know, are known as Velcro dogs, we didn't leave him on the boat on his own, and instead we took it in turns to paddleboard to shore and explore the island. It was beautiful. It's a nature reserve, so it's well maintained and you can cross the island to see the Atlantic coast or stay on the anchorage side to be in the sheltered rear. The beach was dense white sand that your feet sunk into easily, and the island was covered in pine trees. The anchorage was fairly well protected, but I would flag that it is one of the busiest that we've seen. There was also a regular ferry to the mainland for tourists to take a trip to the Sierras Islands. So it wasn't the secret island life you might be expecting, but it was really cool and we would recommend it. Coming in at number 4 is Porto in Portugal. There are very few spots in Portugal that you can anchor along this coastline, and Porto was our favourite. The anchorage really surprised us. It was super easy to anchor, although some people that we spoke to did struggle with the current. We were in quite shallow, but it was absolutely fine, and it's a river, so it's super sheltered from the swell. Watch out in Portugal for weather. Many ports and rivers have sandbars, which makes them dangerous in bad weather. There's a website that will pop the link in the description below that the port authorities update regularly to let you know if they're open or not. In Douro, where we anchored, we left the dinghy on the beach to go for a walk. It felt pretty safe, but be careful because we did spot some needles on the beach. We did spend a night in the marina, as we had friends with us, and that made life much easier to go for a day in Porto and for dinner in Douro, but plenty of people were taking their dinghies up the river into town. You're also treated almost every night to an exceptional sunset from this anchorage. 10 out of 10 would recommend. There's space for a couple of boats on either side of the river, and we didn't have any trouble getting a spot. The holding wasn't tested by us other than the swinging current, as the wind was very light, but it was a great holding from that perspective. No dragging in Porto for us. Coming in at number 3 was Muros. I loved Muros. We were in the middle of a late summer heatwave when we were here, and it felt like our first taste of what this experience could be. It was our first properly sheltered cove since leaving the UK. At first, we anchored just outside of the marina, which was very sheltered, easy to dinghy backwards and forwards to. Muros itself is a really pretty town, and the sandy sea made the colours just stunning. We were strolling past property windows looking at how much it would be to have a finca here and planning a life in northern Spain at this point. That is how much we liked it. While we were here, we met lots of other cruisers doing the same trip as us, including 3 or 4 boats that had been attacked by orcas and had had their rudders removed. One shortly after we had crossed the same patch of water, maybe an hour behind us. It was the closest we got, we think, and it was a real shock to the system and made us a lot more cautious going forward, or going further south. After a few nights in this anchorage, and a quick trip to the marina to pick up a package, our Starlink, we headed across the bay to another anchorage which was just as nice. More rural, because you're on a beach with no real infrastructure, but it was perfect dog walking territory, with warm sea and lots of fish for Walter to hunt out. I think our second favourite anchorage is this because it surprised us so much. Praia de Concha was our first stop after Biscay, and honestly, it made us a little jealous of those who took the inner route for Biscay rather than going directly south. Most people who picked our route will go straight to A Coruña, which is what we were planning to do too. However, at the end of our Biscay passage, we ended up beating into a headwind, and our timing left us potentially looking at coming into A Coruña pretty late at night, which we didn't want to do. New place, late, tired, not a good combination. So instead, we pointed our nose directly to the land and picked the first anchorage that we could find that would be protected from the wind, and boy was it a good pick. I don't know whether the anchorage is fond to us because it was our first bit of land in days after a kind of gruelling trip, or if it was actually as awesome as I remember. Let us know if you stayed here and what you thought of it. It was really beautifully sheltered by a small harbour wall. It gave us a cracking sunset. Walt did a quick trip to the beach. We were sad that in the end we didn't stay there longer. It was just so pretty. So if you have a bit of a slog on Biscay like we did, and you just want the finish line a little bit closer, then bear this in mind in your passage planning as a little escape route. It really did make all the difference. Words cannot do this place justice. Our hands down favourite anchorage on the Atlantic coast was Isla del Norte, again on the Spanish coast. The tiniest little island with the flattest sea, the brightest turquoise water, white sand filled with crushed shells. It was just so beautiful, the Caribbean of the Spanish Rias. The beauty of this area is that it's so quiet and people often skip straight past it, which is pretty mad. The islands are so pretty. Don't skip them because you're rushing to get to the Canaries or to cross the Atlantic. If you decide to go anchor here, watch out for the mussel farms on your way in. We think that's what they were. And keep checking your charts for rocks. The holding was really good, and it was the first place that we could see our anchor, which was useful having the clear water, as within a few moments of arriving, Joe was in the water, checking the damage from our rock hitting incident further up the coast. We only stayed here for one night because we wanted to get things checked properly, but if we hadn't, perhaps we could have stayed here for a week. It was that idyllic. Remember though, there's no infrastructure. It's the true wild island experience. So, that's our top 5 anchorages. There were plenty more amazing ones, but you'll notice that our recommendations are mainly in Spain rather than Portugal. That's purely because with our draft, there were very few anchorages that we could stay in on the Atlantic coast that would be sheltered. We hopped from marina to marina for a few weeks until we made it down to the Algarve, where we could again sit easily on the hook for a while. Have you sailed this coast? Let us know in the comments if you stayed at any of the anchorages above and if your favourite is missing from our list.